In the summer of 1972, a Milwaukee police officer attended a George Carlin performance at Summerfest, an outdoor music and arts festival on the shore of Lake Michigan. The officer was not there for the music. He was there because word had reached the right people that Carlin's act contained language that violated Wisconsin obscenity statutes. Carlin performed. The officer waited. At some point in the set, the language in question was spoken aloud in a public space. The officer moved. Carlin was arrested. The charges were eventually dismissed. The following night, Carlin returned to the stage and performed the same material. To understand what the Milwaukee arrest was about, it is necessary to understand what 1972 was about. Not just for George Carlin, but for American comedy and American culture broadly. The years between 1969 and 1973 were, in a specific and not entirely comfortable way, a testing period. The country was in the process of renegotiating which truths could be told in public, which words could be spoken aloud, which institutions could be named and examined without the examination itself being treated as an act of aggression. Comedy was at the front of that negotiation, as it usually is. Comedians exist in a particular relationship with the boundary between what is permitted and what is not. They are professionally located at the edge, paid to find the place where the ordinary rules of social discourse do not quite apply, and to operate there with enough skill that the audience follows them. The best comedians do not merely find the edge, they move it. George Carlin had been moving it since at least 1969. The transformation from the suited, television-friendly comedian of the 1960 seconds to the jeans-wearing, boundary-testing performer of the early 1970 seconds was not a pose. It was a genuine shift in what he thought comedy was for. A shift from the project of making people comfortable to the project of making them honest. And honesty, in 1972 America, had a cost. The specific piece that got him arrested was a forerunner of what would later become the 7 words material, an extended examination of language and prohibition and the American anxiety that surrounded certain words. He had been developing this material through performances, sharpening it, testing the reactions of audiences who ranged from enthusiastically receptive to visibly alarmed. The version he performed in Milwaukee was not improvised. It was the product of years of thought and hundreds of hours on stage. The police officer in the audience had not come to engage with any of that. He had come because a complaint had been filed, or because an authority had decided that this particular performance in this particular public space crossed a line that needed to be defended. The arrest, from the officer's perspective, was procedural. From Carlin's perspective, it was evidence. He was not the first comedian to be arrested for the content of a performance. Lenny Bruce had been arrested multiple times through the 1960 seconds, in San Francisco, in Chicago, in New York, on obscenity charges that had progressively destroyed his ability to perform and, by most accounts, had contributed materially to his deterioration and death. Carlin had known Bruce. He had admired him. He had been at his funeral in 1966, watching what the weight of legal harassment could do to a man who simply refused to stop saying what he thought. The Milwaukee arrest was not the same thing as what had happened to Bruce. The charges were less serious, the legal momentum behind them was weaker, and the cultural moment was different. It was 1,972, not 1,964. And the country had shifted enough that an obscenity charge against a comedian for language in a live performance was less likely to result in a conviction. The Milwaukee district attorney eventually declined to prosecute, and the case was dismissed. But the parallel was not lost on Carlin. He had watched what institutional opposition looked like up close. He had seen what it could do. And he had, at some point during the years of his transformation, made a decision that the possibility of that opposition would not determine what he said on stage. The decision to return to Milwaukee the following night and perform the same material was not, in his accounting, a heroic gesture. It was a logical one. If the material was right, if the argument it made was correct, if the language it used was the right language for the argument, then having been arrested for it did not make it wrong. It made it more urgent. The arrest was not a reason to stop. It was the most recent piece of evidence for the argument he was already making. He was 35 years old in 1972. He had been performing professionally for over a decade. He had learned, through that decade, the difference between material that was provocative for its own sake, that existed to generate a reaction, to shock an audience into attention, and material that was provocative because it was true. The first kind eventually exhausted itself. The second kind did not. The audiences who came to his shows in 1972 were not all there for the same reasons. Some came because they had heard that he said things that were not supposed to be said, and they wanted to be present for the transgression. Some came because they had been following his work for years and trusted that whatever he was doing was worth paying attention to. Some came, genuinely, because they were interested in the arguments he was making about language and authority and the construction of what was permissible. The arrest gave all three groups something to talk about. It also gave Carlin something he had not exactly been seeking, but could not ignore, a piece of evidence that what he was doing mattered enough to someone to warrant official response. There is a particular kind of validation that comes from being taken seriously enough to be opposed. It is not a comfortable validation. It is, however, a real one. The legal outcome was, in the end, unremarkable. The charges were dismissed. There was no conviction, no fine, no formal legal consequence that outlasted the incident. What outlasted the incident was the material itself, which Carlin continued to develop and perform, which eventually became the specific exhibit in the FCC complaint that Jack Douglas filed in 9073 and the Supreme Court case that followed. The Milwaukee arrest was a step in a sequence that its participants could not have fully anticipated. The sequence ended at the United States Supreme Court. The argument that got Carlin arrested at a Milwaukee music festival in 9072 became, 6 years later, a foundational precedent in First Amendment law. The logic he had been developing through years of performances, the argument about words and their prohibition and the anxieties they revealed, was examined by 9 justices and found, by 5 of them, to be insufficient to overcome the government's interest in protecting children from indecent language on public airwaves. He thought they were wrong. He continued to think so for the rest of his life. He continued to perform the material for the rest of his life. The Milwaukee arrest was a single night in a long career. A police officer in the audience, a procedural detention, a charge that was eventually dismissed. From any reasonable distance, it looks like a minor incident in the biography of a working comedian. What made it not minor was what Carlin did the next night. Not the return. The return was, in a sense, easy, because the alternative was to change the act. and he was not going to change the act. What made it not minor was the consistency of the decision. The Milwaukee night was not a moment of courage under unusual circumstances. It was an ordinary expression of a position he had arrived at years before and would maintain for the rest of his career. He said what he thought. He kept saying it. When the machinery of official opposition showed up to tell him to stop, he noted the appearance of the machinery and continued. The next night in Milwaukee, the house was full.